Alright, so I'm back here with another Panhead top end rebuild. Now I want to do something a bit different with the episodes for this rebuild. I want to split them up into specific areas so that if you're doing this at home, you can just watch the videos that are related to what you're doing and you need help with. So to start with in this episode, I'm going to go through and just do a complete teardown. We'll inspect some stuff, order anything we need. And then on the next episode, we'll go through the heads, I reckon. I need to replace some of these bolts and we'll do a valve job and just inspect the guides and all that sort of stuff. And then in the next episode, I reckon we'll do the honing on this thing, go through all the pistons, make sure they're right, have a look at the rings, maybe we need to order some new ones. And then for the last episode, I reckon we'll just go through this thing and assemble it. So hopefully this way you can just watch what is specific to what you need, and then you don't have to watch a big feature-length film of me talking shit about something you already know. So let's get into tearing this thing down. Alright, so a little bit to start with this little Panhead here. So this guy is a 1952 EL. Now how you tell the years and what model it is on the back here on your VIN number. So in Australia we call this an engine number, in the States this is your VIN number. So the way you tell, the first two digits are the year and then the second two digits are the model. So this model is an EL, so that means that this is 1000cc. If you were to have the FL, it'd be 1200cc. So basically, you're probably wondering why I've got this little bit of tape on here covering up some of the numbers. It's not because the numbers are dodgy, it's because you blokes are dodgy. I don't want anyone stealing these numbers. If someone registers with these numbers and then you go to register your engine, you've got two of the same numbers and then you've got an issue. So that's why you see a lot of people covering them up. So basically all the Panheads are going to be exactly the same, well, pretty well the same. There's a few slight differences from 48 all the way through to 64. So late 64 and 65, you'll have your outside oiler heads. They're pretty sought after just because they're a 1 year thing. So the way these heads oil, they've got oil going up through the barrels and into the heads, into the rockers, and then the same it returns. In that late 64, 65, you've got your oil coming out here and then it goes into the outside of the head. And that's good because, you know, your oil's not getting heated up coming through your barrels, which obviously your pistons are in there making combustion, making heat, just heats your oil up before it gets to your rockets. So basically where I want to start with this thing, there's a few ways you can pull this head apart, pull the whole engine apart, but what I want to do, I want to take these pans off first. Then we'll take the rocket gear out and then pull our push rods out of the way so that we can get in here and undo our bolts. Yes, you can go in here and undo the bolts and then just take this all off in one, but sometimes it's easier to get in here and get a better purchase on your bolts if you take all this shit off first. So let's go through. I'm going to spare you the heartache of watching me undo this, and I'll just quickly undo these and then we can get looking in the top here. Very fucking nice. Alright, so this is basically our pans off and everything in here looks pretty nice. Now, if you're a bit of a modest at this and, you know, maybe you will forget how things go back together, take a heap of photos of when you pull this thing apart, you know. take photos of this head, take photos of this head, take photos of everything you pull apart, and then when you put it back together, if you're unsure of where something goes, you can just look back at your photos. Super easy. So basically, like I said, I'm gonna tackle all this head stuff in another video, but for now, I'm just gonna pull this shit down in this video. So all I wanna do, I just wanna take these lifter blocks off just so I can get the push rods and all the push rod tubes out. But before we do that, we want to mark where this stuff goes because it has to go back in exactly the same spot. So I'm going to mark on each one of these rockers here where it lives. So this rocker, this is exhaust side. So this will be rear exhaust rocker. This will be rear intake rocker. And this will be front intake rocker, front exhaust rocker. Now, these little guys here might be something that you don't have on your panheads. So these are little oilers. So the way these work, when this engine's running and you've got all this oil in here splashing around, these little guys catch the oil and then direct it onto the top of your valves here where your rockers are pushing. Now the reason they don't have them on the rear is because these are full of oil because the gravity holds the oil down here. So these valves generally have heaps of oil down in the exhaust here. So they just give it a bit of extra oil up here and put these little oilers in. If you don't have these in your engine, no huge deal, doesn't really need them. So I'm gonna go through now and let's mark these rockers and pop them off. Alright, so I have all the bolts and nuts off for my rear rockers here. What you want to do, your tins that you pull off are actually perfect to put all your bolts in. So keep your front tin separate and your rear tin separate and just put all the stuff from the tins in the right tins. So all we want to do now is pick these lifters off here, these rockers off here like that. They'll come apart in two pieces. That's no big deal. So just pull them out. They can be pretty stubborn sometimes. Sometimes the rocker just comes out like that. Pull them out, and then, like I said, you put them back together like that, and then put them in the right pans. So I'm gonna go through and do this on all the rockers here, and then we'll come through to having a look at taking these heads off. Alright, so I have all my rockers off here. Now all I have to do is come through and just reef our push rods out like this. So once again, I have all my rear cylinder parts and all my front cylinder parts. So just take the shit out, put it where it needs to go, and then with all your push rod tubes, do the same stuff. Take it out, put it exactly where it needs to be. It's that easy. So basically, after we've done all this, all we really have to do is start undoing all our head bolts. So the reason I took all that stuff off first and just didn't pull the heads off is because these little nuts here, looks like they've been rounded pretty bad. These things must have been used quite a lot. So I'm not going to reuse these nuts, but it's easier to get in there. You get a bit more rotation on your spanner if you take all your push rods and stuff out. So I'm going to go through now and do the grueling process of undoing all of these. Alright, so I went through and took out all of these head bolts that come up from the bottom here. Just when you take yours out, you see how all of these are rounded and really quite screwed up? So when they're like that, they're pretty well impossible to do up. So I'm gonna have to go through and replace all these because there's no way you can tighten these up. And if you did, maybe you won't get them apart next time. So you might have noticed I used a couple different tricky tools to get in here and actually get some of this undone. Like one of them is a 9/16 and it's a 3/4 drive down to a 1/4 drive. And that's just so I can get it in there and actually ratchet it just a little bit at a time. The other trick is grinding down the top of your spanner. Because when you put it in here, the spanner is binding up against the barrel. So there's not much room between the head of this and the barrel. And that's why they're all stripped out like that. So grinding the top of your spanner is a really good trick to getting it in there and not stripping these nuts like these have been. Anyway, the other thing is when you do this one, it's easy just to take the top of your timer off. Don't take the whole timer out, because now all you got to do is static it instead of going through and actually physically timing it again. So I just took the top of the dizzy off, and that's all you got to do there. The other thing to remember when you're putting this back together, this is quite a big thing on shovels too. You see how this bolt doesn't actually come out? So when you are putting this back together, you have to remember to put this bolt in before you put the barrel on. Otherwise you won't get the bolt in. So just something to remember here. Take photos, like I said, heaps of photos, and that'll help you put it back together properly. So let's go through and pop these heads off now. They're completely loose, and have a look what we're working with. So let's start with the rear cylinder, So basically what I'm looking for here in this cylinder, you'll find a lot of times you get cracks between here. Like a crack between your valve seats is a massive issue. Like a crack between your spark plug and your valve seats, like that's all big issues, but these look all right. Now the other thing you want to look is these heads have got a steel insert which holds these bolts in. Because if the bolts went straight into the aluminium, you'd pull them out in no time at all. So these are steel inserts. And over time, having all this pressure on them, it starts to walk the insert out. Now, if I've got a screwdriver here, I can probably show you a bit better. It's not, see, it hits that, it's hitting our little insert. So when you lock this down, the insert is getting all the pressure onto the head and not the actual surface of the head where we need it. So if you come in here and have a look at the head gasket, you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the head gasket surface, and you see how it's got that imprint in there. So that is the imprint of this little steel insert. So that tells you that this area here where it needs the surface is not getting a full load of pressure on it. All the pressure is right here on this little insert. So if it's like this, you're gonna blow head gaskets. So what that tells me is this head needs to be decked. So that's a good start. So let's have a look at the front head now and see what other things we might have going on. So this thing looks pretty well the same. A few of these little guys are a bit risen, and you can see it in the head gasket again. But other than that, they look pretty good. Other than a few broken fins here, I'm gonna go through the head process and show you what I'm gonna do with that. Once again, some American idiot has painted this aluminium head black. Don't know why, gonna fix that as well. So let's kick these heads to the side. As I said, we're gonna go through these heads in a later episode in depth and just solely look at the heads. But for now, let's go through and get these barrels off. Alright, so I'll explain something that's going on here that is super annoying, and the reason why you don't use this style nut. See, this is like a dome nut so that the thread doesn't protrude from the, the top side of it. So what's happening here is when they've tightened this up, they've tightened the top of the dome nut into the stud. So the stud's supposed to stay behind, like maybe one or two of these have, and you're just supposed to take the nut off. So they've used these stupid dome nuts, and now they've locked the nut onto the stud, and now I can't get the stud out. So what I'm gonna have to do, I'm gonna have to put this in the vise, hold that while I undo this. So I'm gonna have to change these nuts to the proper nuts as well. You might think it looks better, but it is really shit. Like, these have probably had the wrong torque spec on them just because they've used the wrong nuts. Anyway, that's one of the jugs off there. This thing's got quite excessive wear on the skirts of this piston, but I will take the other side off and then we'll have a look at that. All right, I've annoyingly wrestled with this stupid thing and managed to get it off just like that. Yeah, this thing's seen some work, eh? So I'll put my cylinders to the side. We're gonna get to them in the barrel video, but I just wanna have a quick look at these pistons because they don't look amazing. All right, so we're looking for a few things here when we get into, when we get the barrels off and we start looking at the pistons like this. What we wanna do, we just wanna we'll get the crank all the way up, so when the pistons are all the way to the top side like that. And we just want to have a bit of a wiggle on this stuff. So when we wiggle this stuff, it sort of gives us an indication what the bearings are like in the bottom end. So you want to just push up and down. So pulling up and down is sort of the main one that you want to look at. So there's no up and down in my rod. A bit of side to side is fine. They're meant to do that. So there's no up and down, which is the main thing. Then we want to hold our rod and give our piston a rock. See if we can rock it in there. We can't. So we want it to have side to side like that, but we don't want it to have rock. So that's good. Let's have a look at this one. So we have side to side. That's pretty normal. What about up and down? This has a little bit of up and down in it, which is not good. Hear it? So that is those bearings in the bottom end starting to go. So this might be a bigger series than what we originally anticipated. So we'll just check the piston, that's fine. I'll get in a bit closer and maybe you can hear this a bit better. So that is up and down movement. So every time this thing fires, it's gonna be doing that, up and down. Then eventually that'll just flog out your bearings and then the whole thing will blow apart. So I'm gonna have to talk to the customer, the guy who owns this, and break him the bad news. But I'm gonna pop these pistons off and then we can have a look at the wrist pins and make sure that's all alright. And by the looks of these pistons, we might need some new pistons as well. Alright, so now that I've got my pistons off, I've just taken the pins out. Now these pins should be a nice tight, hammer fit into your pistons. Like you saw me, I had to take these out with a hammer and a punch. They need to be that tight. If they're loose, you're gonna have to replace these. The other things you wanna check, you wanna make sure that you put these pistons back in the same place you got them. So in my case, it doesn't really matter because I'm probably going to replace these because they have all sorts of pits and all sorts of, gouges and scratches and stuff going on here. I'll address that more in the video on the barrels and the pistons, but for the time being, you want to just remember which way they go. So I usually just get like a center punch, or something, and mark the front cylinder so you know which was the front, and then it's pretty obvious which the back was. The other thing I've done here is I've buffed the top of this piston. Now it's probably a bit hard to see on the camera, but on this piston it has a size here. So that size there, it says 0.03, 030. So that tells me that these pistons are 30 thousandths over. So you can take those barrels to probably 60 thousandths before they start getting like paper thin and not great. So I think with all these marks and stuff in this and in the barrels there, this will probably go another 10 thou over. So just something to remember, make sure this is pointing the right direction. So front is front, you don't have it, 180 to where it should be. You want it the same way and the front on the front and the rear on the rear. So the other thing you want to check with this, let's pop out the pin the rest of the way with our little trusty hammer. So the other thing we want to check is when we have our pin out, we want to put the pin in our wrist pin here and just make sure it is still nice and tight. You should have just a little bit of side to side movement like that, but you shouldn't have any rock or up and down. So these wrist pins are still really good. So you should check it with the right wrist pin, but they're pretty close generally, wrist pins. So all the wrist pin bushes are still good. It's just a pity about the big end in this thing. All right, so the last thing I'm going to tackle in this video, I just want to take these lifter blocks off and inspect the lifters. Because when you do a top end always comes with these lifter base gaskets because these things love to leak. So I'm going to pop our lifter blocks off here and then we're going to have a look what the lifters are doing and make sure that all our rollers are good and that the cam's all good in there. Alright, so I've taken all the bolts out of these here lifter blocks and you'll notice on this one I have a crack on the side. Now that is because the bolts, they sort of bolt down on a taper. So the taper pushes the casting apart and that's why you get these cracks. They're quite common. This doesn't always mean that it's going to leak, but it definitely means you can't put as much pressure on it. So I think the customer wants to change these out, so we will go ahead and do that anyway. So to get these out, just got to give them a nice knock. A lot of the times when people put these on, they glue them in, which is exactly what I'm going to be doing. So sometimes they can be quite difficult to get off. So something just fell out of that. Anyway, let's put these to the side and take the other side out. But remember, these are going to go back in exactly the same spot, same as the pistons. So a nice little blow with a soft hammer. Don't use your hard steel hammers on this, you'll just dent all this. So I'm going to pull these out, push the motor to the side, and we'll have a good look at them. So the other thing we want to look at is our cam and stuff in here. I wonder if you can see that a bit better. So you can see our cam in here. So what I want to do, I just want to turn this over, just using the rods here. Turn this over and I just want to make sure that we're not missing any bearing material off our cam in there or anything else. It all looks pretty nice in there. Now you probably hear all that banging and knocking when I turn this over. You probably think, oh, that sounds like shit. But you know what it is? It's this stupid alternator here. So instead of a normal engine running a generator, this is an alternator. So this has got a bearing and all sorts of stuff in here. So what's happening when you're turning this over, you really hear it at idle. It's the magnet knocking back and forth in the poles of the magnet. So when it sees magnetism this way, it knocks that way. When it sees it the other way, it knocks the other way. And that's the noise that you're hearing. When these things idle, they really sound like you've done a bottom end, but this is all it is. That's why I hate alternators on these things, but they do work really well. Anyway, that is pretty well our cam. Looks all pretty nice in there. Now, I'm probably going to take this chest off anyway, but I just, for good practice, if you're not taking that off, just a good practice to have a look in there and make sure you're not missing any bearing material on the lobes of your cam. Now, just like the rest of the stuff, you don't want to mix this stuff up. Now, these lifter blocks will only go a certain way in this engine, so you don't have to worry about that. You just want to worry about not mixing these guys up. So you just want to pull these out like that, keep them the same way, like the same rotation, everything. You want to put them back exactly where they were because that's been their home for this long. You don't want to change it up and hurt them for some reason. So these guys are solid lifters. So there is no hydraulic dampening in these lifters at all. So a lot of people do the hydraulic swap on these. I've done it on my solid lifted engine and it really shuts them up. They run so much nicer. You don't have to worry about, doing your pushrod clearances and tolerances and stuff all the time. They just set and forget. So these are the old school method. And basically all you want to check on these things, you don't have excessive wear on your barrels here, so you just chuck your fingernail across it. These look pretty good. You want to spin your wheel, you want to knock it up and down, make sure there's no play, because play will give you, you know, a noise in there, a knock. Now this lifter does have a bit of knock up and down. So luckily I'm changing these anyway because I'm replacing these blocks. So this is a good example of when you want to change it. So this guy has a little bit of knock up and down. So we just go through. That's an even better example. See how much knock's in that? See that knock in there? So that is what you don't want. That means the rollers in this guy are flogging out and they will let go. So that will cause all sorts of weird noises and your adjustment will always be out. So that is very bad and flogged out. This one's got a little bit as well. And that one's good. So lucky that we are changing these things because this one is considerably flogged out. So this is always a good thing to check on your engine. And then I'll show you how we're going to put these back together once we are in the assembly episode of this series. Alright guys, that is pretty well it for this episode. As we saw in this episode, those main bearings are absolutely flogged out. So in this series, it looks like you're going to see a full panhead rebuild now. I'm going to have to split those cases, I'm going to have to split those crankshaft flywheels, I'm going to have to pull the whole thing apart, put new rod set in it, new pin, everything. So this series just gotten a lot bigger. As I said, we'll be doing that. We'll be doing the barrels, we're doing pistons, we'll be going into that in depth. We'll be doing the heads, we're going to have to service the heads. Judging by the condition of the engine, I would say all the valve guides are flogged out. So we'll do a full service on that and then we'll be able to assemble a complete engine. You know, get those, you know, get these old cases, get them all vapor blasted, get them all looking super nice, polish some stuff. This engine will look $1,000,000 when it's done. So stick around, keep up to date with the episodes, and I'll see you next time.